Good afternoon from Brussels. Welcome to all of you on both sides of the Atlantic who've joined us. I'm Ian Lesser from GMF in Brussels, and it's a pleasure to have a wonderful group of people with us today to have a conversation about a very critical set of issues. It's an important conversation for GMF, if I could just say at the outset, because especially for our program, which we call GMF South, which covers Turkey, the Mediterranean, broadly North-South relations, there are a few more important issues these days than what has happened, what is happening in Syria, what is likely to happen, what it will mean for the region, regional actors, including Turkey, and also for transatlantic relations and US policy. And we'll get a chance in the hour that we have to discuss all of those things, I hope, today. And let me just say, give you a little bit of a roadmap to what we're going to do. I'm going to ask our speakers to speak very briefly to share some reflections with us, and then we'll have a bit of a conversation among ourselves, and then open it up to all of you, and you can come into the conversation with a question or comment on the Q&A function, using the Q&A function. That would be great, and I'll keep track of those things. We're really fortunate to have with us today a wonderful set of speakers, and if I could just introduce you to them very, very briefly at the start. Bassam Barabandi, who is Director of External Relations and co-founder of People Demand Change, based in Washington, although he's actually in Morocco today. Oytun Orhan, who's the Levant Studies Coordinator at the Center for Middle East Studies, ORSAM, in Ankara. Rich Outzen, non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and also geopolitical analyst and consultant with Dragamon LLC. And Bente Schiller. Bente is head of the Middle East and North Africa Department at the Heinrich Böll Foundation in Berlin. Rich, of course, is based in Washington. So let me start out, if I could, perhaps, Bassam, with you, to share some thoughts with us from a Syrian perspective about what's happened in Syria and what we might expect.
Thank you for having me. Look, the Syrians are really happy, extremely happy, that we are under shock, under very positive shock, that what we have been demanding in the last 13 years, it just happened in 11 days. It proved our point that the regime is collapsing. The West, in general, they were not ready to listen to our thoughts that if you push it, we can get something. Today, we are a new chapter. We have a new government. If it is not government, it's a new de facto underground forces. People are optimistic. They are dealing with that group in positive way till today with all the criticism we are seeing over there. I think there's a general feeling among Syrians that we want to avoid the mistake that bring us to Assad rule. In other words, I think the people will not accept a one-man show or one party show or one ideological show. I hope that, and we are pushing for that. Challenge is big. Syria is distracted. Syrians are coming back to Syria from many different parts of the world. That will open the doors for the consequences of what happens in Syria. It shows Iran is weaker than what we think. Russia is weak and weaker than what we think. The refugees in Europe, I think there's a window now to come back to Syria. Russian position in the Mediterranean, now it shows that they are willing to give something out of it. Turkey is the winner. It's on it, even if like it or they don't like it, they own it. They own what happens, and that gives Turkey two ways of thinking. If that group succeed in moving Syria to right place, Turkey will take that credit. If that group went or go wrong direction, more Salafist, more Islamist, more even the Syria they don't like, everybody will blame Turkey. Even Turkey has, I don't think, it's not clear how much influence they have on day-to-day operation. And technical operation and governing operation, I don't see they have influence on that or interference yet on that level. The GCC are happy and worried. They should be happy to say that we are happy. Worried because they don't need again Islamists on their border. You know, they call the Islamist political Islam. in many different parts of the Arab world. So what we are today, the Syrian steering Shara, Mr. Shara, and this new group, it's not even government. Legally, constitutional, they are not government. So the force on the ground, they have the Syrian future, basically. If they acted very well, very good, very smart, very rational, I think part of sanction will be waived, more Syria will be back, Syria will move in the right direction without being a polarization phase between north and south or east or west. Just be enough. The Israeli factor is very, very interesting to see that during all the war with 11 years, they didn't attack the Assad military warehouses the way they attacked it after Assad left. So the message we get is that he is protecting Israeli, or Israeli were not worried about all this defense or military equipment Assad has, because he will never attack them. So they don't want this to happen, to give it to the people, unknown people. Again, the Israeli, they enter into Syria something like 20 to 30 kilometers. And it's clear that they are not going to leave anytime soon. So the things is really dynamics, very, very moving. Every day there's something new. I think the Europeans are more open to the new system, the new change in Syria than others. I think mainly because the refugees issue, they want to solve that problem, to get guaranteed that refugee will back to Syria. Partly less important, I think Russia and the Mediterranean. They want Russia to leave Syria. That means Russia will not be able to reach to Africa easily, let's say, and they will not have influence on the Mediterranean with the NATO and most of Europe there. So everything now is moving. I'm the person who is calling the Arab countries to be in Damascus full time, full capacity, to avoid what happens in Iraq after 2003 when the Arab left. They left it between Iran and the United States and Iran got. So today we have a space, we have the time that all the countries that have interest in Syria be in Damascus, sit together with the Syrian and find formula to avoid Syria from any polarization. We don't need polarization. We need reconstruction. We need education. We need schooling. We don't need any more war. I mean, that's the more my mood and the Syrian mood in the West. I will stop here.
Awesome. Thank you very much indeed. I mean, that was terrific. If I might just, before we move on to Oytun, ask you just a quick question, follow-up question, just your assessment of the risk of fragmentation.
Today, look, historically, we never been fragmented. So the people here, many Western, especially the United States, they are calling for dividing Syria, federation, federation, or deconfederation. Basically, they talk about the Kurds. And they talk about ISIS, basically, Kurds, ISIS, this equation they connected. I believe two things. Number one, the ISIS issue, it's a serious issue, but the ISIS issue in the jail are the issue, not outside, not just leaving cell. The 30,000. And their problem before that, most of these are foreigners or non-Syrian. Their countries were not able to accept them because there's no legal evidence that they were fighters, they did the crimes. At the same time, they cannot keep them. So today we solve that problem. That in having new government in Syria, the West can deal with them. We can open free trial, legal, fair, and according to international standard trials for these people. And we solve that problem. So the people who are guilty will be in Syrian jail under international. The people who are not in jail, we find something. But that will solve big, huge problem. That's the Kurds. The Kurds, we have two things. We have PKK and we have the Kurds. The Kurds, to be fair, historically, they suffered more than any other component from a Ba'ath party, from Assad party, and from, I mean, they really, they were living in very bad situation. The Assad, they never give their names or holidays or never recognize them. So definitely they suffered. But the PKK is different from the Kurds on that level. So I think the new social contract in Syria should keep the PKK outside Syria. And the Kurds, they have the right like any Syrian. So they are Syrian Kurds, like that, not Kurds as a Kurds. So I think the components are there to go forward, to move forward as a Syria that fit all Syrian. And again, the major point that I was talking about is we don't see it to be polarization between Turkey and United States concerning the PKK. I mean, it's not fair for Syria. HTS itself is a problem. I mean, they are listed. So how we deal with a government listed as terrorist group and its leader is terrorist guy, there's reward for him for justice, $10 million. It's critical things, how we move forward, how we move for the sanctions. I think the more we have economic stability, we have unified Syria and vice versa.
Thanks so much, Bassam. Oytun, if we could come to you, sitting in Turkey, how does this look, both in terms of what we have seen, but also in terms of Turkey's stakes and interests and risks as well? Over to you, Oytun.
Thank you, Jan. Thanks for the invitation. Actually, from our perspective, there are two main reasons which led to the collapse of the regime. First of all, the regional context, the Israeli-Iranian escalation in the region, which also had direct implications on Syria. Since 7th of October, Israel is constantly targeting Iranian proxies in Syria. And also, depending on the Israeli-Hezbollah conflict, Hezbollah forces were withdrawn to Lebanon. So in that context, the opposition forces, including Turkey, were perceiving a kind of opportunity in Syria to start a new military offensive. That's the first thing. And secondly, I think the failure in the political solution and the normalization process. Turkey was pursuing a normalization process with Assad, with mediation of Russia and Iran, which did not succeed. So I think the failure in this process also led Turkey to reconsider a new solution or a kind of new move to unblock this deadlock in the political solution process. So I think these were the two main factors which led Turkey or also opposition forces to conduct a new offensive. But I think even in this case, the main Turkish calculation was not to topple the regime. I don't think so. I mean, this is also what I also hear and also get when I talk with Turkish officials, that it was also a big surprise that the regime fronts collapsed so fastly. So the main goal was to push for Assad regime and also its supporters for the political solution and the normalization. This was the main goal, I think. But I think depending on the developments on the ground, it also encouraged opposition forces, but also Turkey to move forward so that it lead to Hama Homs and then Damascus and the fall of Assad regime. So from my point of view, at the beginning, it was not the main calculation from Turkish side to start this offensive. The main logic was to push Assad for a political solution and to push Assad for the normalization process. So what are the opportunities and risks? Of course, in Turkey, we have a very positive mood. Turkey feels itself, and as well as the Turkish public feels itself on the winning side. They feel that they are victorious. I mean, that is very understandable because the opposition forces, both armed and also political opposition groups, are somehow supported by Turkey till the end. So Turkey was the guarantor of those forces and also the main supporter of those forces. So at the end, these forces had become the rulers of Syria. Of course, this will give Turkey an opportunity in the future of Syria. Turkey thinks that we will have a better friend, an ally in Damascus in our with regards to our priorities in Syria, which is the fight against terrorism, YPG issue. Secondly, the refugee issue. The Syrians can return to Syria. And on the other hand, also the future of Syria will also give a broader opportunities for Turkey in its geopolitical competition with its rivals in the region against Israel, Iran, and other competitors. So Turkey feels itself victorious. Containing Iran is also another gain, another perception of opportunity from Turkish point of view. And also the reconstruction process. Turkey thinks that Turkish companies will take the lion's share in this process, in the reconstruction process. So these are all opportunity perceptions, but also there are some risks because this success puts also the whole responsibility on Turkey's shoulder. So any kind of failure in Syria in this transition period will put Turkey on the target. So if there will be an infighting within the armed opposition groups, if the new government will not be inclusive, so that there will be some critics, these critics will be directed to Turkey. So that is putting a huge burden over Turkey's shoulders. And also Israeli actions in the Syria is also another problem. I think from now on, as Iranian influence in Syria has been contained and Iran is out of the game, I think there will be a kind of Turkey and Israeli competition on the Syria field. So that is another risk. And Israeli actions after the fall of Assad is not helping Turkish efforts in Syria to establish security and stability, and also helping this new Syria government to expand its sovereignty and authority to whole Syria, because Israel is totally undermining, at least collapsing the strategic military assets of the new Syria government. So in that regard, we consider Israeli actions as a threat for Turkish expectations to have a united Syria. So these are the challenges, and the YPG issue, which is the biggest priority of Turkey, is still there. It is not solved. There are some gains. Tel Rifat and Manbij was liberated from YPG. This is a first-hand gain from Turkish point of view. Now the Turkish-backed SNA forces is trying to move forward to east of Euphrates River, but still the US blockade is still there. And also Israel side is talking about, helping the Kurds, and in Turkish mind, this is considered as helping YPG and YPG regions, and also trying to reach a federal system in Syria, which Turkey will not want to see in Syria. So these are the challenges and risks for the coming period. So I would stop here. Maybe we could continue in the discussion.
Sure, absolutely. Oytun, thank you very much indeed. And, I think we'll come back certainly to this question of whether Turkey and the United States can be on the same page when it comes to what happens in Syria in the future through some of the issues that you've already mentioned. But, maybe I could just ask you about the issue of Syrian refugees in Turkey. Obviously, this is a broader question than simply the refugees in Turkey, but what are the prospects for change on this front, and how much of a factor is this in the Turkish calculus?
It is a factor. There were two main priorities, as I said, the terror threat and also the refugee issue. So actually the main motivation for Turkey to normalize its relations with Assad was that. So trying to find a way for a safe return of the Syrians. And in that regard, a political solution which will, establish these conditions. So now, with the collapse of the regime, Turkey thinks that the conditions are fully suitable for that. So there is no security risk. That was the main reason for Syrians not to return. So we established buffer zones, security zones on our border, but Syrians were not, eager to return those areas because those areas do not have, geographical depth, not much economic opportunities, and these areas are not their homeland. I mean, they want to return to their homeland. So it did not create too much success. But now we have a bigger opportunity. The whole Syria is open, so there is no security risk. So, and also we have a partner in Damascus. I mean, these issues can be handled if you have a real partner, sincere partner. So we have better opportunity, but still in Turkish mind, I think even in best case scenario, the half of the Syrians will not return. But I think the Turkish public will not consider this issue as a risk or a kind of will perceive this, look at this issue as from a negative perspective. In case the numbers are getting lower and lower in time, the Syrians in Turkey will be perceived from a positive perspective in which they contribute to Turkish economy and also in which they are a bridge between Turkey and Syria. So the the negative perception was related about the increasing numbers and that they will never return to Syria. So now we have a better condition, but in best case scenarios, we don't think that at least half of the Syrians will not return, but which is not a problem, which is something positive, I think.
Thank you very much for that. Benton, let's go to you. You've spent a lot of time in the region. You follow this closely. We've heard, if I could characterize it this way, two, in different ways, rather optimistic assessments, if I can put it that way. I mean, of course, we start from the basis of the fall of the Assad regime, which is good news on so many fronts. But what comes next? We've heard quite positive assessments, in a sense, I think, from our two speakers so far. How do you see it, Benton?
Well, I think for the toppling of the regime, everybody agrees it is a horrible regime. And now with all the revelations about the atrocities that we already knew about, but to see them really coming in the shape of mass graves, etc. So I think nobody really sheds a tear for that regime. And I think that should be clear that this is an amazing achievement. The Syrian people have been so determined. And I mean, it's a victory, not only for the Syrians, but I think for humanity to get rid of a regime that is using chemical weapons against its own citizens. And it's also a victory against Iran and Russia, who want to go that far. And therefore, I think it is really impressive and something that we have not witnessed over the past years, if ever. And I think it's important to notice the victory is not only HTS's. It was carried forward by the offensive of HTS, but without the Kurds being in the offensive and also taking places, airports, cities over from the regime. Without the Druze coming from the south, I think it is a movement that came from many different entities in Syria. And I think also that the transition so far has been rather, well, calm is the wrong word, but we have not witnessed massive acts of violence. I think it's an achievement of the Syrian people who have been prepared and who have been working constantly and very strongly towards a different future. And this is why I'm also optimistic. And I hear also many of our Syrian partners are optimistic, saying, well, we managed to overcome challenges like ISIS and the regime. So who else is going to scare us? We're not shy any longer of asking for our rights. And this is also what we've seen in Idlib over the past year, at least, where there were regular protests, not only against the regime, but also HTS. So I think there is a good basis for some optimism. I think there are concerns that are well formulated already. What does the future hold for the sovereignty of Syria? What does the future hold for minorities, for women's rights, and I would say basically for citizens' rights? And I think we don't have clear answers because the performance of HTS is mixed. All the messaging has been very smooth and understanding of what the needs should be, but then there is also voices coming from the interim government restricting freedoms in terms of, well, women can hold positions, but possibly not all positions. So it's not unified, and I think it's valid to be concerned for that. And what we're hearing from all the people we're talking to, Damascus is rather chaotic because HTS simply doesn't have the personnel to carry out the administrative tasks they want to take on. They've recognized the importance of electricity provision, water, sanitation, garbage removal, etc. But at the moment, it's very chaotic because for this task, they don't have the personnel. And we should also keep in mind, if they wanted to dominate the rule over Syria, they would need a lot of people to do that. And I think they have a population that is a very diverse one and one that has found the courage to say, well, there are certain degrees to which we accept the imposition of one group over the others. So I would kind of join the choir of optimistic voices, but I think there are risks not only from inside. No dictatorship ever allows for a real opposition to grow, which will make it very difficult for all those who have been building political efforts in the past to feel that in this situation, a pluralistic discussion and elections could be possible, because groups might tend to think it's existential. It might be a first time and then never again. This is why I think we will need to watch out for these rifts. But I think also what has been talked about by Oytun before, it is very relevant, the influence of foreign powers and military interference, what Turkey currently is doing to further its interests is risky, because it could play with the difficult balance between Kurdish and Arab interests. I think this is a very, very sensitive point. And I think also the Israeli actions are really striking. I mean, they're advancing on the Golan, like advancing occupation that is already there for parts of the Golan Heights. Then tackling the Syrian army, the marine, the weapons depots, at a time when everybody wants the Syrian interim government or the upcoming one to establish stability. And the European voices are also there saying, well, you need to push out the Russians. Well, how to do that if there is basically clearly no military infrastructure? And then the bombardments are also not helping. It's, I think, 500, 600 bombardments that have happened since the regime was toppled. Hundreds of them happened already before. But in this fragile situation, I think there would also be the opportunity for opening a new page, especially with Israel. I think preconditions were never better. Because of the course of the past years, Israel helped to evacuate and treat people who were wounded in Syria. They brought them over. The white helmets, the Syrian civil defense, when evacuation was needed, they had the possibility to at least evacuate 400 of them through Israel. So I think there is a basis for not only a military and security-based approach, but for thinking security through the political and diplomacy lens.
And to thank you very much. You know, I think we may come back to this in the broader discussion, but let me just take the opportunity to ask you now, can you imagine, you know, what we have seen in Syria after, well, let me step back a moment. So many years of impasse. Why now? Why did this change?
Well, I mean, I've been really closely following everything inside and outside Syria, and I think the regime was always frail. They needed the support of Iran in 2013 already to turn the tide, and if not in 2015, Russia had decided to intervene with its air force, Assad would long be gone. So it was clear it was borrowed power he had, and this is why also we never gave into the normalization discourse. And then Russia is very interested in Ukraine, which obviously is a priority for Russia, much more important than anything they had as engagement in Syria. Assad was a difficult partner because he time and again ruined the plans that Russia had, and he ruined normalization, which Russia wanted to allow money flowing into Syria. So I think basically he had outlived the period in which they considered him useful and not just a burden. And for Iran, obviously, the Israeli advances against Iran's most powerful ally, Hezbollah, were crucial because Hezbollah has been instrumental in squeezing the life out of besieged areas. They really saved Assad. And I mean, by doing so, I think that brought the risk over them. This is how Israel could easily understand their command structures that were rather intransparent before. So they allowed themselves for this vulnerability. Now they paid for it and they are out. So I think it was also a moment that historically could not have been better because the main supporters of this otherwise fragile regime were not ready there to prop it up any longer.
Thank you. Rich, curious about your own assessment of the issues that we've been discussing so far, but also maybe to broaden it out a little bit and think about the sort of regional geopolitical balance and competitions that we have been seeing and will probably see, and how you see that looking. And I'd like afterwards maybe to come back briefly on especially on the U.S. policy piece of this. You're very well positioned to tell us a little bit about that at the moment, but also maybe even a little on how the new Trump administration might see all of this.
Right.
Rich, over to you. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks, Ian. It's good to be with you and with my distinguished colleagues on the panel here. Well, it's been an amazing month. Really, people were surprised. We were all surprised, I think, by what happened. It's very unusual in the study of international relations or geopolitics to see something like this, where if you take a 10-year snapshot of all the key players' strategic approaches to this, just about everybody's failed, right? The only one that, if we can look back, the only state actor anyway, that seems to have had a successful and fairly consistent 10-year strategy is Türkiye. The United States strategy changed in 2014 when the Obama administration, in response to the metastasis of the ISIS problem, essentially de-scoped most of its Syria policy, which had been based on the need for Assad to go to yield power. We had been providing military and political support to the opposition. All of that changed with the fall of Mosul and the rise of the ISIS caliphate, territorial caliphate, which one can argue it was aided and abetted by Assad as a matter of his own strategy. The United States essentially de-scoped its Syria policy to being the de-ISIS policy. And with that, essentially adopted the YPG as an instrumentality to reduce the need for American direct intervention. And what this implied is a sort of agnostic approach to Assad, saying that, well, yeah, maybe he'll fall, maybe he won't. At different times, there was this idea that maybe after the fall of the ISIS caliphate, the United States could simply exit and hand off the YPG to Assad and to the Russians. All of that failed, in essence, because the facts on the ground changed and there are some unforeseen things. But this idea that maybe a fractured Syria is all there's ever going to be, and that might not be antagonistic to U.S. interest, I think clearly failed. We failed to adapt our policy to keep up with the changing facts on the ground. Russia's policy and the Iranian policy of sort of having a dependent but fairly robust Assad regime also failed. He was unable to hold up his part of that bargain. And of course, Russia, it looks like they're going to lose the bases at Tartus and Hamamayim unless there's some big surprise in negotiations. Iran, of course, has taken a beating. Hezbollah has taken a beating. It's hard to speak of a common European policy over the period of time, but there were voices in Europe that were pushing for normalization with Assad. And I think the strategy of anyone who wanted to normalize with Assad, there were some in the Gulf, some in Washington and so forth, pressing for that. That's also failed. If you look at what Ankara was trying to do, they said, we'll host the refugees. We will support the political opposition. We will train and coordinate and improve the military, the armed opposition. And ultimately, I think the pivot point was this establishment of a safe zone, which would be an area where they could, where the opposition and its various factions could practice governance, could start to try to build legitimacy with the local people, and frankly, to coordinate between the very fractious elements of the Syrian opposition. It's worth remembering in the recent lightning drive, the 11-day war that broke Assad, only roughly 20% of the fighting forces were HTS. You had other groups that are sort of along this aligned, you know, the NLF and so forth, that are sort of aligned on that same, but not in Idlib and not under HTS control. You had the Syrian National Army that was essentially Turkey's proxy that they had trained and improved, that provided a large bulk of the forces. You had Southern forces. I might differ with Bente a little bit on the role of the Kurds. I think the friendly takeover of airports from the Assad regime in extremis was not really contributory to the fall of the regime. That was more just taking assets as they became available. But in any case, the role that Turkey played in coordinating and taking a long-term view on this at the level of intelligence and the armed forces and the political support ultimately won the day. And that puts Turkey in a very interesting and pivotal position. Now, I don't think that Turkey wants to sort of run Syria, run Damascus as you know, its own subsidiary government. I don't think that's the case. The Syrian interim government that's been in the Turkish controlled areas in the north, I think ultimately will be dissolved, right, and reabsorbed into the central Syrian state. So it's not that Turkey is going to be able to call the shots, but I think at the popular level, there's a massive appreciation and gratitude among many Syrians, not all, to Turkey for what its role was. And there's a lot of soft power there. As a practical matter, Turkey has been involved in the last 5 to 10 years in building or trying to build military establishments, intelligence establishments, and stabilization packages across many different places. You look at Libya, you look at Somalia, efforts that it's provided to a number of different governments, very active in Africa in general, protecting and supporting Qatar during the period that it was under blockade from the rest of the GCC. So I think Turkey has done this sort of thing before. I would expect that Turkey's position, both as an economic driver during reconstruction and also as sort of a mentor and big brother as the Syrian state reasserts its authority, is something that they're well suited to and is going to provide some interesting economic and geopolitical opportunities. So why did it surprise everyone, including myself? I think there were 3 things that people missed, these long-term, and the other speakers have sort of alluded to them. The first was the hollowing out progressively of the Syrian state. And the fact that it never was able to develop a political economy that built bridges to people who had been opposed to the regime, they never even really tried. And that goes in addition to, spurning Turkey's and other diplomatic efforts to get Assad to accept some, at least, of the substance of Resolution 2254, which laid out a political path. They never pursued that. Meanwhile, they were still under sanction. The economy was hollowed out. They were largely dependent on drug trade, Captagon, and so forth. And the military forces and security forces, as has been stated, were heavily dependent upon Hezbollah, IRGC, and Russian support. So the state was getting weaker and weaker, and I think people sort of assumed it was going to get stronger or stay the same over time. We missed that. And the massive impact of the wars in Ukraine and the Middle East that prevented Hezbollah, Iran, and Russia from reprising the role that they did in 2013, 2014, 2015, really, I think, were underappreciated as dynamics driving that as well. The thing that stands out for me now is that the West and the international community is at sort of a crossroads, because while there's sort of a yes but response, people are glad Assad's gone now that the secrets of Sednaya can no longer be hidden, and the role of Assad in allowing Iran to prosecute a war and Hezbollah to prosecute wars against Israel from that territory. Whatever the sins and problems of the Syrian opposition, HTS and the others, I don't think it can be argued that they're worse than Assad. So that's the yes, this is a good thing. I'm happy to see the end of this terrible period of suffering for the Syrian people. But it's a yes, but, because there's huge apprehension, and this maybe is a change from the optimism that we've been discussing so far in Israel and in Washington about what comes next. There is a huge distrust of HTS and of some of the groups, ORSAM and others that Turkey has supported, an idea that, look, once a jihadist, always a jihadist. Now, Shara or Jolani has made some very good statements, talked about perhaps even disbanding HTS. There's clearly going to have to be a coalition government that's going to include not just the various elements that helped overthrow Assad, but also people that were maybe not supportive of the opposition. They're making the right sort of sounds about an inclusive Syria. I've seen the videos of people celebrating Christmas in Aleppo and Homs and other areas. That gives reason for some optimism. And yet this idea that maybe it turns into Afghanistan, in a Levantine Afghanistan, is still causing a lot of concern in the West. So I think if you want to look at it from Washington's perspective, of course, fascinating time for this to happen at the end of one administration that knows it won't be in position to implement whatever policy it articulates towards the revolution and what's just happened, and an incoming administration that's still staffing and still coming up with sort of the guiding principles for the region. What has happened does comport somewhat with Trump's desire not to remain militarily, that he stated multiple times, in Syria. And as if the Syrian state is reconstituted in such a way that actually be able to exercise sovereignty over its territory, that goes a long way to addressing the ISIS problem, or at least it can. Now, there's a sort of a dilemma here, though. If we do not engage out of fear for what's going to emerge, and if the West waits to flow aid and to recognize legitimacy and to engage in general, then maybe the experiment fails and we do see a failed state. On the other hand, we have to be careful. The Jolani or Shara's designation and the bounty on him, it didn't happen for no reason. There were ties to Al-Qaeda. There were certainly things. Now, is the evolution that's been manifested verbally and vocally, is that real? Is that genuine? I think the prudent thing, and again, I can't speak for the incoming administration, but my advice to them, if I was asked, would be keep a roadmap, incentive-laden roadmap for how to re-engage. It's okay to have concerns and to insist on some conditionality, but don't miss the window. The window to help build we're not going to build, but to help support the building of a better, a more stable, a cohesive Syria might just result in a Syria that's far less antagonistic to Western goals and interests, and maybe end up as the most democratic Arab state in the Middle East. We'll see. I mean, there's potential here. So let's not miss the opportunity out of the fears that we have. But those fears are still palpable. I'll finish by saying, as there's a little bit of grief anytime a policy fails. And I think, again, the West and just about everybody else's policies did fail with regards to Syria. The stages of grief denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. Where are we? I think we're still bargaining, right? But and there may be a little bit of depression. But ultimately, once we accept that there is a new reality in Syria, I think the West can play a very good and a very positive role in seeing the right path taken by the new government in Damascus.
Rich, thank you very much. I want to remind our audience that you can send questions in using the Q&A function, and we're going to get to that in just a moment. But Rich, I just wanted to ask you just on the U.S.-Turkey piece. Are we going to be on the same page with regard to? We're not broadly speaking. We could have another seminar on that, and we often do, and we're happy to hear your thoughts on it. But at least with regard to the situation in Syria. What's the outlook briefly?
Well, I'll choose the optimistic side on this with one caveat. So the optimistic side says, look, we've always had large overlap between what the U.S. and Turkey want to see ultimately. We want to see a stable Syria. We want to see refugees go back to Syria. We want to see the end to Assad's repression. There were different thoughts about modalities about how to get there. And the U.S. never abandoned the humanitarian assistance program. So in theory, we still have interests more aligned than misaligned. But there is this issue of what happens with the YPG, and especially since U.S. troops still are in northeast Syria, east of the Euphrates, there's some real risk there, because if the SNA continues to put pressure on the YPG, SDF east of the Euphrates, that has some potential danger for U.S. troops. We take our force protection very, very seriously. So I think the U.S. and Turkish alignment here can be preserved and improved. It's going to be very difficult to avoid a massive disagreement if the lives of U.S. troops are put into danger. And again, Trump's already stated that he has the desire to move out. The question is, how do we get to that reality? How do we get to the reality where U.S. troops are out, where the Syrian government really is in substantive control of the whole country, including east of the Euphrates, and do that in a way that doesn't result in unnecessary loss of lives in the Northeast. So I think that's one. And the other is, of course, for the U.S., Israel matters a lot. This is where we have to stay engaged, because Israel is our ally and has a very special relationship with the United States. It's a bipartisan, support is very strong for that. And Turkey's a treaty ally. We have to make sure that Ankara and Jerusalem are talking about this, and that the fact that they are currently very misaligned on Syria and to some extent almost antagonistic in their views, we have to help kind of thread that needle and make sure that the interests of both Turkey and Israel are not damaged by what emerges with the new government in Damascus. So there's some work for us to do, and there's some work for Ankara to do. But with those two very sensitive issues, I think the general alignment still pertains. And I think the Trump administration has a far more sophisticated understanding of this situation than most people give it credit for.
Rich, thank you. I'm starting to look at the questions that have been coming in, and there are quite a number of them. I may have to group some of them together, but there's one kind of common thread in a few of them. And I'm going to put this maybe back to all of you, perhaps starting with you, Bassam and Bente also, and others. Are we seeing the start of another, well, let's use the term Arab Spring, not a good term, but a broader movement towards regime change, potentially, which has its ups and downs, obviously, as seen from various places around the region? Are we pulling on is there a thread being pulled on here that's going to lead us somewhere else over the next months and years, or is this sui generis? Bassam. Bassam, I think you may be muted.
So most of the countries that they are till now under Iranian influence or Iranian incubation, they found the Syria model is inspiring. Yemen and Iraq. Through our communication, look into their medias, the way they celebrate the winning, it wasn't about Assad rather than about Iran, that Iran and Iran proxies. So if we see Arab Spring, it will be anti-Iran rather than domestically in some parts. This number one. Number two, which is very important things for me as a Syrian. Al-Shara for me is doing what Hafez Assad was doing. He is sending the right messages for all the Western countries, all the regional countries. He said, I will not fight Israel. I will not allow any terrorist group in Syria. I will not support Hamas or Hezbollah. I will respect the minorities. All the messages, I will reserve the refugees, and all these messages to everyone to make the Western happy. But he is not sending the right message to inside Syria. Till today, only his people are taking control of everything, and that makes people unhappy, uncomfortable, worried. Still, we are happy. Still, it's 10 days. We say still haram. It has 10 days. Maybe tomorrow will be better. But till today, all his appointment, it doesn't fit Syria, 100%. It goes against Syria. And here, the importance of the sanctions. So I'm the person who fight for waiving the sanction now on Syria. But you know what? We need the sanction to be, like Rich said, a roadmap. Mr. Shara, the more you make to be inclusive Syria, to be good Syria, to be stable Syria, the more sanction will be waived. There's no free check. The minute the US or the Western, they waive the sanctions for their own interest, like bringing back the refugees, and they don't deal inside what's going on. Unfortunately, all the messages that we're getting from the West is about minorities and the women. Even though in the last 10 years, Sunni Arab were killed and the minority were saved. And they were killed by the minorities. So it doesn't make sense for the Syrian to listen what minorities you are talking about, what women. I mean, everybody who knows Syria, they know the women were taking lead in the revolution from day one, as a woman, as a fighter. So it doesn't make sense for real estate. So we know it's more their interest. But in order to make Syria, again, not polarized between Turkey and Israel, not polarized between the United States and Russia, we need Syria to be stable. The only way to be stable is Mr. Shara to be stable himself.
And if I may turn to you, how do you see it, both on the question of the evolution and sanctions and lifting of sanctions, maybe especially from an EU point of view, and under what conditions, but also this question of, you know, a broader trend that may emerge as a result of what we've seen in Syria that's regional?
Well, I think regarding the sanctions, we should carefully look which ones to lift and which ones to keep in place, because there is a whole set of sanctions against human rights violators. And I mean, they continue making sense. However, I think what's most effective and what is most difficult now to handle for Syria is the sectoral sanctions and sanctions on exports, for example, oil and gas. So I think there is a certain set of sanctions that should be studied in depth. And I think for the EU, the problem somehow is they would need to revise their own sanctions. However, the US sanctions top somehow the EU sanctions, because for many companies, it's much more relevant to obey by sanctions by the US. And I think there are different sets of sanctions there in place, the CISA ones, the ones under the Magnitsky Act, and a number of different ones. So I think it might take time to unpack them all. And here, I think it matters absolutely what you, Richard, was saying regarding the opportunity and the window that is there now. I think it needs to be done rather swiftly, whatever we want to do to have an impact and to be able to use this as incentives. We should be rather swift in formulating it. When it comes to the Arab Spring, I think what we're seeing in Syria now, it's the continuation of the spring in Damascus. It is not coming out of the blue. It is not a new movement that came after the old one was defeated. However, I think the protesters and the entire Syrian population just paid a very, very high price. And now it was achieved by different means, not when they were starting to protest. They were insisting on doing it peacefully, and in the end, it could only be achieved by military means. So it's not the same. And obviously, so much has been lost in terms of hope, inspiration, and so many important people to really fill this change with content. But at the same time, I think it is an inspiration. I would very much look to what Iran will be doing, because its influence in the region has been curbed significantly. And I think the Iranian regime had a kind of hubris. They thought, I think, they could win it all. They felt very complacent about what they had achieved, and they saw this being decimated within months. So I think we should watch out what happens there. But we have in each of these places different sets of regimes with their different power structures. So for Iran, for example, even though I would wish that this changes, the relation between the regime and the economy is very powerful. So, I mean, it's really something that's not that easy to break up. And therefore, I think the way for the Iranian people might still be long. I think what's in the proximity of Syria, Lebanon, the crisis that Lebanon has is not about toppling a regime. It's about finding a way to have a government first, and the crises that have been piling one on top of the other. So I think there we saw protests against the government, which is now only a caretaker government. However, we don't see that something new is emerging. And I think it will still be very much affected by what happens in Syria. So possibly if the initially mentioned scenario of a decentralized state or the state falling apart in Syria happens, we will see something that will probably not be a spring of any kind, but it will be definitely affecting Jordan. It will be affecting Lebanon, and probably in different regards also the other neighboring states, because that will make the whole situation much less controllable.
Bente, thank you very much. And I'm conscious of our time. We had a lot of questions. I'm trying to pull some of these together, but and I have a last question for you all, a lightning one. But if I could come to you, Oytun, your thoughts on, is this the place of this in the context of an Arab Spring, past, possibly future?
Well, I would also like to mention about these sanctions issue, if I may.
Briefly.
I think the sanctions, if it continues, will not help because Turkey is trying to establish a sustainable system in the opposition held areas in the north. So all kind of institutional capacity transfer to those areas. Turkey is trying to help those areas, but still there are lots of challenges. And now the opposition forces, the new government will run Syria. So even in those areas, Turkey had lots of difficulties. So in Damascus, Turkey will need international cooperation in order to overcome these problems, challenges. So in that regard, I think the sanctions will not help to overcome these problems. But we have two other very effective tools in order to push Jolani and HTS to be responsible and inclusive. So we have international legitimacy and recognition. HTS needs recognition and legitimacy. So in that regard, he needs to be open to some demands from the external parties, including Turkey. And also reconstruction of Syria, that's a necessity and also priority for HTS, so that I think they will be also open to those kind of political concessions. And thirdly, I think the Syrian people is totally different from other examples in the region. So Syrian people will not be okay with a new authoritarian system. So I think he will be also open to those demands, social demands coming from the Syrian people. And the Syrian people is fighting since the last decade. So it is impossible for them to accept a new authoritarian state. So rather than sanctions, I think using these tools could be more effective to have a more inclusive government in Damascus.
Okay. Oytun, thank you very much. Rich, let me come to you, but I'm very conscious again of our time, and I did want to get thoughts from you and really from other speakers on another question that came in, which I think is really a wonderful way maybe to end our conversation, which is the question of, what are the wild cards, the black swans, if you like, the things that could surprise us, that could upend some of our analyses, whether they're internal or they're regional. Really, very quickly. Rich, over to you.
Well, it's two black swans in a row is a lot to ask, isn't it? We just had the biggest.
Go ahead.
We just had the biggest of all black swans, right?
I guess because
a flock. So I think probably there's one black swan that would be positive and one that would be negative. The one positive black swan would be the renewal of strategic consultations between Israel and Turkey in a manner that leads both to have a moderate but constructive view of potential threats coming from one another and coming from developments in Syria, because that sort of a stabilization would unlock a lot. If Israel and Turkey have an understanding, then I think a lot more in terms of European and American aid and coordination can be forthcoming. I think the negative black swan would be if we do see sort of a punitive approach taken, a divide and conquer approach, either by some in the Gulf or some in other places, that are very, very antagonistic towards HTS and the other groups and very worried about Turkish influence in Syria. Some may decide that a unified Syria is not really in the collective interest at all. And in that case, all sorts of hedging behaviors among the different Syrian actors come into play. And then we could even see some sort of resurgence of Russia. For instance, like if you're Shara or others in Damascus, and you feel that you're still subject to sanctions and you're still, the YPG is still in control of the Northeast and the Israelis in the Southwest, and there's no economic aid flowing, then maybe a renewal of some sort of a relationship with Russia comes into. I'd like to think that everybody sees the great potential, the positive potential here, and that the positive black swan is more likely than the negative black swan, but we can't rule out that further division and incitement from outside can have negative impact.
I think the black swan, if allow me, in the last 2 minutes,
Please.
are the Alawite. Alawite, this is the really black swan in Syria. They lost the power just 10 days ago. They were humiliated. They will be humiliated more. The more sectarian feeling after Sadnaya things, it escalated the sectarian against them. Now they are still under shock. Till today, they are not balanced yet. If the new government, they didn't absorb them seriously, absorb all these leaders, all these forces to the markets, let's say, not to the army at least. I think they have the potential to make insurgency against all the Syrian, because they're feeling that we lost. There's no hope for us to win or to gain anything. That's the black swan. I mean, this is what happens in Libya. The people who support Muammar Gaddafi, they started.
Yep.
This is what happened in Yemen, and this is what happened in Iraq. It takes 2-3 months to start. They were under shock, then they were humiliated, they were isolated, then they get together and fight back. And here we have Iran, Russia, and Assad himself. They will support such kind of movement. And that's where we're back to Mr. Shara and the wisdom he should have to absorb everybody.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Bente, a black swan. Or maybe
Possibly,
a wild swan.
let's talk about a black swan that would be positive, and that would be if indeed the HTS movement currently would be able to set up a more inclusive interim government, because that would be the strongest sign if people really were represented in a fair way and if they would have a say. That would be amazing. So I think that would be the best black swan we could dream of, since I think for the future, the black swans with a negative connotation are much bigger. I think we have to be afraid of all foreign interests, and I think mainly Russia waiting for everybody to ask it coming back, because things in Syria spiral out of control. We should be prepared for that, because we would have also witnessed in the past methods of Russia regarding disinformation, boosting certain voices, spreading information that also leads to violent action. We're not safe from that just because we see a Russian military withdrawal from Syria.
Thanks so much. Oytun, a last word, a last swan.
The armed groups, the opposition armed groups, how to integrate those groups into the new security setup in Syria will be a challenge. I think the Israeli actions, especially from the Turkish point of view, is considered as a real challenge. So which Israel is totally collapsing the strategic military assets of Damascus, which undermines its efforts to spread its sovereignty and authority, which could also support federalist demands in Syria. So that is also a kind of challenge from Turkish point of view. And also the HTS and Jolani's actions. So any kind of failure in this regard will be a problem. So Turkey will be a follower of his actions, whether he will be inclusive or not. Turkey will put its efforts to be more inclusive. So these are the main challenges that I see in the coming period.
Terrific. Thank you very much. We're at the top of the hour exactly now, and just allow me a few thanks at the end. First of all, to all our speakers, Bente, Rich, Oytun, Bassam, thank you for being with us from all your different locations. It's been a terrific conversation. We're very grateful for that. Let me also thank my GMF colleagues, Özgür and Ceylan and William in different places again for making this happen. And thanks finally to all of you who've joined us, and we look forward to seeing you again at GMF soon. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Good
Thank you for
afternoon
having
to
us.
you all.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.